3 owners, 30 years, millions of dollars spent trying to explain one stretch of Utah desert, a private research team with its own dedicated scientists, a billionaire aerospace founder who poured 2 decades of his life and his fortune into a single investigation, a United States Defense Intelligence Agency contract worth 22 million taxpayer dollars, a sitting U.S. senator on the record saying this exact property mattered to a federal research program most Americans have never heard of. And after all of it, after every dollar spent, every camera installed, every scientist who ever set foot on this land, the man who invested more time and money into understanding this place than anyone alive said the same thing the very first family said back in 1994, when they were the only ones who knew this ranch existed at all. The mystery was never solved. This isn't a story about whether monsters are real. It isn't a story about flying saucers or curses or shape-shifting creatures in the dark. It's a story about something stranger than any of that, because it's something we can actually prove. Why some of the most resourced, most serious, most skeptical people in American science, business, and national defense spent 30 straight years trying to answer one question about a 500-acre cattle ranch, and walked away every single time with nothing but more questions. Let's start with the land itself, because before there was a legend, there was just dirt, sagebrush, and a family trying to raise cattle. The property sits in the Uinta Basin of northeastern Utah, in a remote stretch near the town of Ballard, bordering the Uinta and Ouray Indian Reservation, home to the Ute Indian tribe. And here's the first thing almost everyone gets wrong about this place. The name doesn't actually belong to the land it's attached to. The word Skinwalker isn't a Ute term at all. It comes from Navajo tradition, where it describes a figure called a Yinaldlushi, a being said to have gained the ability to transform into animals through the practice of dark or malevolent magic. It's a specific, serious concept within Navajo spiritual belief. But somewhere along the way, outside media picked up the word and stitched it onto a ranch that sits on land belonging to a completely different tribe. The Ute community, whose reservation actually borders this property, didn't name it. Outsiders did. And that mismatch tells you something important right from the start about how this story has been told over the decades, often by people who weren't from here, weren't part of either tribal tradition, and weren't especially careful about the difference. What is better documented and far less disputed is that ranching families across the Uinta Basin had been describing unusual livestock deaths and unexplained lights in the sky for generations, long before any single property carried a famous name. A local school teacher named Junior Hicks began quietly compiling written reports of strange incidents across the region as early as the 1950s. He wasn't chasing fame. He was a teacher who kept running into the same kinds of stories from his neighbors and his students' family year after year, and started writing them down. By the time this particular ranch became internationally known, Hicks already had decades of regional documentation sitting in his files. That's an important detail because it means the story didn't begin with one dramatic event. It began as a slow accumulation of local testimony that nobody outside the basin was paying much attention to. That changed in 1994 when Terry and Gwen Sherman purchased the ranch. They bought it from the previous owners, the Gorman family, who had reportedly experienced unusual events of their own during their time on the property. Though, like so much of this story, those earlier accounts were never independently documented in detail. The Shermans moved in expecting to run cattle. Within months, according to their own accounts, they were dealing with something else entirely. They described cattle found mutilated with what witnesses called surgical precision. Clean, bloodless wounds that local veterinarians reportedly struggled to explain through normal predator activity. They described unexplained lights moving across the property at night, and they described an animal, wolf-like in appearance, that seemed unaffected by gunfire, according to their own retelling of events. It's critical to say clearly, none of these specific claims were independently verified by outside investigators at the time. They are the Shermans' own reported experiences, given to local law enforcement and to Junior Hicks, and nothing more can honestly be said about them at this stage of story. But whether or not every detail holds up, the effect on the family was real and documented. They said the pressure of these repeated incidents became unbearable, and it eventually drove them to sell. In 1996, journalist Zach Van Eyck published the Sherman family's account in the Deseret News, a major Utah newspaper. That article is a confirmed, verifiable piece of journalism, and it did something the Shermans' private experiences alone never could have done. It put this obscure ranch in front of a much wider audience for the very first time. And it put the story in front of exactly the kind of person who had both the curiosity and the resources to do something about it. That person was Robert Bigelow, a Las Vegas real estate and aerospace entrepreneur who had built his fortune through budget suites of America before turning his attention to the far edges of aerospace research. A year before the Van Eyck article, in 1995, Bigelow had already founded a private organization called the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDIS, specifically to investigate unexplained phenomena using rigorous instrument-based methodology rather than folklore or hearsay. When he read about the Sherman family's ranch, he recognized an opportunity, and in 1996, he purchased the property for approximately $200,000. What happened next is where this story stops being a local legend and starts becoming something closer to an actual scientific research program. Bigelow installed a full-time ranch manager on the property, along with a network of cameras and motion sensors. Over the following years, he rotated trained scientists through the site, tasked with documenting and, if possible, explaining whatever was happening there. This wasn't a weekend ghost hunt. It was a sustained, funded, multi-year research effort, backed by a man with the resources of a billionaire and the patience to keep the investigation running for the better part of a decade. During this period, researchers reportedly described a range of instrument malfunctions and unexplained sightings, though, and this bears repeating, very little of this raw research data was ever released publicly in a form that outside scientists could independently verify. What we do have, and what is fully documented, is a book. In 2005, NIDS scientist Colm Kelleher, together with investigative journalist George Knapp, published Hunt for the Skinwalker. Science Confronts the Unexplained at a Remote Ranch in Utah. That book compiled the non-classified findings of the Bigelow-era investigation and remains, to this day, the single most detailed public account of what NIDS actually observed and recorded during those years. It's the closest thing this story has to a primary scientific document written by someone who was actually there doing the work rather than someone reporting on it from a distance. And then in 2008, the story left the private sector entirely and stepped directly into the machinery of the United States government. The Defense Intelligence Agency awarded a contract worth roughly $22 million to Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, known as BASS, Bigelow's successor organization to NID, under a program called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, or AWSAP. This wasn't leaked gossip or an internet rumor. It was a real federal contract, funded with real taxpayer money, awarded to a real defense contractor connected to the same man who had spent the previous decade investigating this exact ranch. For years, almost nobody outside a small circle of insiders knew this program even existed. That changed in December of 2017 when the New York Times published an investigation revealing the existence of ABASAT and a related Pentagon initiative that would later become publicly known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. The Times' reporting, later corroborated through Freedom of Information Act disclosures, connected this federal research effort to Skinwalker Ranch as a documented site of interest. And in the aftermath of that reporting, former Nevada Senator Harry Reid went on the record himself, confirming that he had personally helped secure the funding for this program and stating plainly that he considered the ranch relevant to that research. Think about what that actually means. A sitting United States senator, someone with direct oversight of federal defense spending, put his name on the record, connecting a line item in the federal budget to this specific piece of land in rural Utah. That is not folklore. That is not a viral headline. That is a matter of congressional and journalistic record. In 2016, before any of this reporting became public, Bigelow quietly sold the ranch to a Delaware-registered shell company called Adamantium Real Estate LLC for a reported price of around $500,000. The identity of the actual buyer behind that company remained a closely guarded secret for nearly 4 years. Roads leading onto the property were blocked. The perimeter was reinforced with cameras and barbed wire. Warning signs went up to keep people away. Whoever had bought this ranch clearly wanted privacy, and for nearly half a decade, they got it. That changed in 2020 when Utah real estate executive Brandon Fugal, chairman of the Utah division of Colliers International, one of the largest commercial real estate firms in the world, revealed himself as the true owner behind Adamantium Real Estate. His announcement coincided with the premiere of a new History Channel documentary series called The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, which Fugal executive produced and starred in alongside a rotating team of scientists, military veterans, and researchers. According to Fugal's own account, he didn't buy the ranch as a believer. He bought it as a skeptic with capital, fully expecting to spend a season or two debunking 70 years of accumulated local legend. But according to his own retelling, only months after taking ownership, he and several others witnessed what he described as a silver gray, disc-like object hovering above the property's central mesa in broad daylight with multiple witnesses present. Whether or not you find that account convincing, it's a matter of record that Fugal has said repeatedly and publicly that this single sighting is what shifted his personal investment in the project from financial curiosity to something closer to obsession. Since then, The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch has run for multiple seasons and become one of the History Channel's highest-rated series, with a companion show called Beyond Skinwalker Ranch, following the same investigation from a different angle. Across those seasons, the production has escalated far beyond simple camera surveillance. During filming for later seasons, Fugal's team drilled directly into the ranch's central mesa, the same flat-topped rock formation that has been the focus of sightings for decades, and reported recovering metallic material that, according to their team, was inconsistent with the surrounding natural geology, alongside sensor and spectrum analyzer readings. The crew described as erratic and unusual at the exact same time. This drilling and its findings are documented on camera and discussed openly by Fugal and his research team in interviews. What has not happened at any point is independent, peer-reviewed scientific confirmation of what that material actually is or where it actually came from. That distinction matters enormously. A production team recovering unusual material on camera is a documented event. What that material means is still honestly and completely unresolved. So let's step back and lay out, plainly as possible, exactly what can be said to be true after 30 years of investigation, separate from any individual witness account or televised dramatization. It's true that a working cattle ranch in rural Utah changed hands 3 separate times over 3 decades, and that in each case, the sale was connected in some way to reports of unexplained phenomena on the property. It's true that a private research organization, fully funded and staffed, spent nearly a decade formally investigating this land using scientific instrumentation, cameras, and trained personnel. It's true that the United States Defense Intelligence Agency awarded a multi-million-dollar federal contract to a research company directly connected to the same individual who had already spent a decade investigating this exact property. It's true that a sitting U.S. senator went on the record linking this ranch to a federally funded research program. It's true that a television production team drilled into the property's mesa on camera and recovered material their own team described as geologically out of place. And it's true that after every single one of those developments, over 30 years, no owner, no scientist, and no government program has ever produced a public, independently verified conclusion about what, if anything, is actually happening on this. That last point is really the heart of this entire story, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. 3 distinct turning points explain why this case never closed and why, if anything, it only grew larger and more serious with time instead of fading away like most local legends eventually do. The first turning point was that 1996 Deseret News article. Before Zach Van Eyck's reporting, the Sherman family's experiences were a private local matter, known mostly to their immediate neighbors and to Junior Hicks. After that article ran, the story reached a national audience for the first time, and more specifically, it reached Robert Bigelow, a man whose personal resources were about to change the entire scale of what this investigation could become. The second turning point was Bigelow's decision to fund an actual, sustained, instrument-based scientific investigation, rather than simply purchasing the land as a curiosity or a tourist attraction. By installing cameras, sensors, and rotating trained researchers through the property for the better part of a decade, NIDS gave this ranch something almost no other paranormal claim in American history has ever had: a genuinely documented long-term research record. And even with all of that infrastructure, all of that funding, all of that scientific rigor, the investigation still couldn't produce a clear answer. If anything, that failure to reach a conclusion, despite such serious effort, is what made the case more compelling to the people who came after Bigelow, not less. The third turning point was the 2017 New York Times investigation. That single piece of journalism didn't solve the underlying mystery either, but what it did was far more consequential in a different way. It proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this case had grown far beyond a Utah ranching story. It had grown into something connected to an actual federal defense budget, an actual Pentagon research program, and the public statement of an actual sitting United States senator. The file didn't just stay open after that reporting came out. It got bigger and it got more serious in a way that no amount of local folklore ever could have achieved on its own. The ripple effects of this story reach well beyond the boundaries of the ranch itself. Before the 2017 reporting, most Americans reasonably assumed that official government interest in unidentified aerial phenomena had effectively ended decades earlier with the Air Force's Project Blue Book investigation, which wound down in the late 1960s. The ASAP revelation proved that assumption wrong. They showed that serious, well-funded federal research into unexplained aerial phenomena had, in fact, continued quietly for decades afterward, and that revelation directly contributed to a wave of renewed congressional hearings on unidentified aerial phenomena in the years that followed. Hearings that trace back, at least in part, to a contract connected to this exact 500-acre property in rural Utah. The ranch also changed something less obvious, but arguably just as significant: the format and standard for how paranormal and unexplained claims are investigated at all. Earlier generations of UFO and ghost hunting media relied almost entirely on personal testimony, someone telling a camera what they saw, with little in the way of physical evidence or instrumentation. The NIDS Bigelow model, and later the History Channel's approach under Fugal, leaned much more heavily on measurable data, radar readings, thermal imaging, spectrum analysis, physical samples with something resembling a chain of custody. Whether or not the underlying phenomena turn out to be real, that methodological shift raised the bar for what a serious investigation of these claims is now expected to look like, for better or worse, across an entire genre of media. So what do we actually take away from 30 years? 3 ownership changes, 1 published book, 1 federal contract, and 1 very public senator's statement, all pointing at the same isolated piece of land. Maybe the most honest lesson is that resources alone don't guarantee resolution. Robert Bigelow had nearly unlimited personal funding, a dedicated research staff, and 2 full decades to work with. And he still couldn't close the file. That's not a small thing. It suggests that whatever is or isn't happening on this property, it isn't the kind of problem that simply yields to enough money and enough time. There's also a lesson here about how quickly a local legend can climb the institutional ladder when the right person with the right resources gets interested. What began as one family's private, unverified experiences in 1994 had, within roughly a decade and a half, become a documented line item connected to a federal defense budget and a matter of on-the-record statements from a sitting United States Senator. That's an extraordinary trajectory for any story to travel, paranormal or otherwise. And it happened almost entirely because a handful of specific real individuals, a journalist, a billionaire, a senator, a real estate executive, each decided, in turn, that this particular question was worth taking seriously. And finally, there's a lesson about the limits of even the most well-funded, well-intentioned investigation. Sometimes, after every dollar has been spent and every camera has rolled and every scientist has come and gone, the most honest and most professionally responsible answer really is simply, we don't know. Bigelow said as much himself, describing the ranch's central mysteries as never solved in his own words after 20 years of trying. That's not a failure of the investigation. In a strange way, it might be the single most honest and credible statement anyone connected to this entire story has ever made on the record. 30 years, 3 separate owners, a published scientific account, a $22 million federal contract, a United States Senator's name attached to the file. And after every bit of that documented history, no one, not the Sherman family, not Robert Bigelow, not the NID scientist, not the Defense Intelligence Agency, not Brandon Fugal and his current team, has ever been able to close this case. Maybe that's what actually makes this story different from every other unsolved mystery in American history. Most unresolved cases eventually fade, not because they're solved, but simply because people stop looking. This one hasn't faded at all. If anything, the people looking have grown more resourced, more scientifically rigorous, and more determined with every single passing year. From a single ranching family with a notebook of strange sightings all the way up to a Pentagon-funded research contract with a senator willing to put his name behind it. So maybe the real question at the center of this story was never about what might or might not be underneath that mesa out in the Utah desert. Maybe the real question is this: how long can an answer stay just out of reach when everyone with the resources and the will to find it keeps refusing to stop trying?